Hello, everybody. I'm from ENS in South Africa. We are apparently Africa's largest law firm. We have offices in 4 countries outside of South Africa. My background is I'm a chemist by trade and a patent attorney. I ran my own practice for about 15 years before joining up with ENS around about 2 years ago now. I won't be talking about designs today, so I'm not quite sure how this slotted into what's gone before, but I'm going to just try and bring you up to speed a little bit on what is happening in Africa at the moment. What are the latest sort of economic trends? How is that affecting IP? And what are the different options for obtaining IP protection in Africa? Around about 12 years ago, a publication called The Economist described Africa as the hopeless continent. It's also been described as the forgotten continent and the lost continent. So where is our forgotten continent 12 years later? If you have a look at the table on the right-hand side of this slide, the left-hand column shows the fastest growing economies based on GDP in the world over the last roughly 10 years or so. And you'll see that 6 of those countries are from Africa. And on the right-hand side, there's a sort of prediction for the next 5 or so years. And if those figures are to be believed, then there will probably be 7 African countries in that top 10. And the other prediction of note is that Africa is likely to emerge as the fastest growing economic region globally for the next decade or so. Those of you who are perhaps familiar with Africa's geography would perhaps have noted that those 6 countries that were the fastest growing in the top 10 of late, they all come from sub-Saharan Africa. Sorry, just lost my spot there. Yeah, and as Africa as a whole has actually, on average, is starting to overtake the African countries in terms of economic growth, and certainly will do in the next decade. Just in case you don't believe the figures that the IMF or the Economist have produced, which we've already had a look at, Ernst & Young did a survey in 2012, which they called an attractiveness survey, which had a look at economic output and the ease of doing business, etc. And if you have a look at that growth of GDP curve over the last 20-odd years, you'll see that it's a very nice, impressive upward trend, which contrasts very nicely with the rest of the world at the moment. And if we have a look at this, the last 5 years or leading up to 2016 or so, the expected increase in growth is around about $690 billion, which is more or less the size of the entire African GDP in 2003, less than 10 years ago. Okay, so if the economic trend in Africa is upwards, what is actually driving the growth? Well, first of all, mergers and acquisitions in Africa have surged substantially over the last 10 years, and particularly the last 2 or 3 years. In addition, there's been a substantial increase in trade with Africa, with Asia and China and India in particular. Speaking from a South African perspective, which at the moment is the largest economy in Africa, Europe has traditionally been our biggest trading partner. And I think in 2012, for the first time, it was on a par or slightly less than trade with China. Okay, so what are the reasons behind these economic trends? Okay, there are a number, and they're probably reasonably obvious if you think about them. But for the record, The return on investment in Africa is higher than most developed countries at this stage. The continent is rich in natural resources, gold, platinum group metals, copper. The middle class in Africa has nearly tripled in size over the last 3 decades. And that growing middle class is driving spending from a retail perspective. This middle class is largely an untapped market. At the moment, there's very low penetration, and the markets are less competitive, so it translates to more opportunity. The growing size of the African market and urbanization means that by 2030, 50% of Africans will be living in cities with increased access to these markets. Infrastructure investment is substantial and more is needed in energy, water, waste and sewage, irrigation, as well as the obvious ones like roads and port infrastructure. Something else that Africa has in its favor is that renewable energy, or clean energy, which is a sort of buzzword around the world at the moment. Africa has pretty much a clean slate. There's not much infrastructure in this area, so there's an opportunity to build renewable energy structures going forward without any legacy factors. On the political scene, there's been a decline in the number of hostile conflicts in Africa over the last 10 years or so. But perhaps one of the most important factors is a growing realization amongst African governments that in order to attract investment, they need to make their countries attractive to investment, which means political stability, and also creating economic policies that are viable and open to expanding trade. Rwanda is one country that has succeeded in that front. Just a little bit more on trends before we move on. PricewaterhouseCoopers expects Africa to be one of the most important mining M&A jurisdictions. Well, that was the expectation for 2012 because of the resource potential and increasingly investor-friendly climate. I haven't seen figures which confirm whether or not that's true yet. It's too early in the year, but I expect it would have been. Chinese and Indian companies are also looking to invest in telecommunications in Africa. The biggest M&A deal on the continent came out of India. Bharti Airtel, almost 11 billion acquisition of the African assets of Kuwait Zain. Often intra-African mergers precede acquisitions by large developed market firms. For example, Walmart acquired a South African business, Massmart. It's South African based, but they do have branches around Africa, and that there was a series of mergers that started way back in the 70s there. 53% of the 152 M&A deals completed in 2011 were between African nations, and many of the bigger African companies are reaching out to their local markets, with South Africa being the largest African acquisitor at the moment. East Africa is also increasingly an attractive target for investment, boosted by political stability and the formation of an East African community, which is a sort of regional cooperation bloc made up of Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. Ethiopia is Africa's fastest growing non-energy economy at the moment and has seen several large acquisitions in beer and consumer goods markets. South Africa, our largest consumer goods company or consumer foods company, Tiger Brands, made a big acquisition there in 2011. And on the alcohol front, Diageo and Heineken acquired 3 of the state-owned breweries in Ethiopia for around $400 million US. Okay, you've probably seen about enough economic data at this stage, but one last slide on that. If you have a look at this one, you will see that 15 African countries have attracted 71% of new FDI projects since 2003. And if you just have a look there, you'll see that there are a couple of countries there that are little green ticks next to them. And those are countries where it's considered to be relatively easy to do business in. And speaking of that, Africa's generally considered a rather difficult market to succeed in. but in a survey done by the World Bank and a report that they issued, this makes quite interesting reading. Won't be too surprised to see the bunch of countries lurking in the bottom quartile down there as being very difficult to do business in. But what perhaps is quite surprising is that in the top quartile, there are 3 African countries that are very easy, relatively speaking, to do business in, and they actually rate higher than China and Russia. Okay, well, based on the economic data, there should be an indication to you that there should be a greater importance placed on protecting IP in Africa. But again, it's typically not a place that's high on the list of priorities for multinational companies. They don't know how. It's always been a low priority, and not much is known. And Africa's a scary place, and there are horror stories that abound. So what are the options? How do you go about getting IP protection in Africa? Who do you talk to? Before we get on to that, what are the trends? Well, firstly, the patent and trademark filing trends are mirroring economic trends in Africa. So we have seen high double-digit growth in both patent and trademark filings more or less throughout the continent. And I would exclude South Africa. Our filings are increasing, but not at the same rate as the less developed markets. Who's leading the charge? At this stage, mainly the US and European corporates, although Chinese and Indian companies are becoming much more active in IP protection. And sectors that are ahead of the pack at this stage: pharmaceuticals, obviously, with Africa's great need for drugs, IT and telecommunications, mining, and also with the expanding middle class, you've got retail and luxury goods as well. This graph and the next just show the extent of the increase in filings over the last 10 years. It does look fairly impressive, but I must say that in most cases it's off a fairly low base. But the point is that the trend is certainly on the up, and again we expect that to continue. Just to correct, the sort of legend on the side of the graphs is not in any particular order, and if you are interested in the highest increase in filings, in trademark filings over the last 14 years has been Nigeria, followed by Burundi, Rwanda, Arepa and RP, which are the 2 regional filing institutions, are sort of middle of the pack, with South Africa and Ethiopia down the bottom. Kenya is also reasonably developed, and that also hasn't increased as much. On the patent side, leading the pack is Burundi, followed by Kenya and Ethiopia. There's been quite a lot of activity in Kenya on the patent side, even including a bit of litigation of late. But also not entirely surprising to see South Africa at the bottom of the pack there. Okay, so who do you talk to when you want IP protection in Africa? At the moment, there are roughly 3 categories of IP firms. You have regional or local firms providing IP services in a particular country or a limited group of countries. You have IP firms that are based in Europe or the Middle East, providing services into Africa. And then you have large law firms based in Africa with a stated strategy of providing IP services across the African continent. What is the reason behind having this sort of three-tiered structure almost? One of the reasons is the diverse legal landscape in Africa, which is a legacy of the colonization of the continent. You have Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone, as well as Roman Dutch law, and even a couple of others, Sharia law. So it is a complex sort of landscape. Right, well, what are the options in terms of IP registration in Africa? It's a massive continent. You can fit China, the US, Japan, India, as well as a couple of others into the size of Africa. There are 54 different jurisdictions. Largely, the laws have undergone reforms from the times when protection was acquired, literally through an extension from a European country's patent or trademark protection. We have two regional filing regimes which do simplify the process a little bit. ARIPO, which is the African Regional Intellectual Property Organization, roughly speaking covers some of the old English-speaking or the old English colonies. And then OAPI, which is the Organization of African Intellectual Property. I won't butcher the French pronunciation. And that covers typically the old French-speaking colonies. Okay, OAPI. You can see the member countries up there. As I've mentioned, they are typically the old French-speaking countries. The way that the system works, these countries have no national protection whatsoever. They were required to renounce their national laws when they joined OAPI. So when you file, whether it be a trademark, patent, or registered design, you don't need to designate one or more of the states. If you file, you get all of them. Specifications can be filed in English or French, so typically not much to do in terms of translation costs. The effect is that any contentious issues are dealt with by the national courts, so they would analyze the OAPI regulations and make a decision based on that. But there's no central OAPI court. Just a couple of other fairly interesting features. From a trademark point of view, if you need to prove use, which you need to do at the time of renewal, you only need to prove use in one of the 16 member states. Something else that's quite interesting on the trademark side is that for certain infringements, typically those where there's fraudulent infringement activity, there are criminal sanctions available. On the patent side, there's no substantive examination. So although the upfront costs can be relatively high because they have ridiculous excess claim fees and penalty fees for length of specification, there's only formal examination, so your costs after that are very limited. Okay, moving on to ARIPO. There are currently 18 member countries, and they are listed there. Somalia, you will see, is highlighted because you actually cannot you can't obtain patent, design, or trademark protection there, even though they have signed the agreement. Nobody quite knows what's going on there at the moment, but they haven't enacted any of the regulations into their own legal system to be able to give any kind of practical implications to their signing the treaty. From the ARIPO point of view, the ARIPO registration has the effect of a national registration. You can, should you wish, apply directly for protection in any of these countries. So when it comes to an enforcement situation, then the national law is applied, and the court in that whatever country is in dispute will decide the issues. From a trademark point of view, there are no use requirements for an ARIPO trademark as a whole. However, if there's an issue in one of the individual jurisdictions, the national law would apply there. So if, for example, Ghana had a use provision of 5 years, then that would apply for that territory only. And again, your patent specifications may be filed in English, so no translation costs. With a repo, there is, on the patent side, there is a substantive examination. Typically, it's arranged from the headquarters in Harare, but it's not performed in Africa. It's typically outsourced. Just one other comment here, well, two other comments actually. For a repo patent application at the moment, it's possible to designate 17 of the 18 countries, Somalia being excluded. Rwanda is the most recent signatory to a repo. And if you have a PCT application, for example, that was filed after September 2011, then you are able to designate Rwanda as part of a repo. On the trademark side, there are only nine member countries that have signed the trademark treaty. Unfortunately, we wouldn't recommend using the repo trademark as a filing mechanism. Only 2 or 3 of the countries have actually signed it into their own national laws. And although a repo is fairly adamant that your trademark will be valid in those countries, none of the IP firms in Africa that I'm aware of recommend filing that route. We would rather recommend filing directly in those countries. The other difficulty with Africa is finding information before you even contact somebody. But there are some fairly reliable sources of information. WIPO, particularly on the trademark side, has an African bureau which covers about 45 different countries, and in their trademarks on their trademarks website, you'll find a fair amount of information. The other possibilities, really, some of the IP firms that practice in Africa have got a lot of information on their websites, and that typically you'll have a scenario like that highlighted there. You can hover over a country, they'll give you all sorts of jurisdictional information, IP information, legislative and regulatory framework information as well. Okay, so just to summarize then, IP filings in Africa are likely to continue growing as long as the economies keep their upward trend, and that would seem fairly obvious at this stage. Protection will increasingly be sought for oil, gas, telecommunications, pharma, agriculture, biotech, water treatment, and solar technologies, as well as the old faithful mining technologies that have driven filings in Africa in the past. Unfortunately, Africa often has other priorities that are not in any way related to IP laws. And things like compliance with TRIPS and improvement and amendment of IP laws and processes are not high on the list of priorities as a norm. But with the increased interest in IP in Africa, we do expect that the systems will continue to evolve and be updated. There's a lot of pressure from IP organizations, both within Africa and outside of Africa. WIPO works quite extensively with some of the African countries. And as well as business moves into Africa, not only business itself, but also their home governments are also lobbying for changes and improvements all the time. Yeah, so that's about it. Any questions?
Any questions? Yes, back. I have a question. I heard recently that Brazil is championing the creation of a Lusophone trademark along the lines of Sorry, I guess I'll repeat again. I don't know if this makes any difference, but Brazil apparently is championing the creation of a Lusophone trademark involving Portuguese-speaking countries around the world. It just seems to be in the stages of early discussion. My understanding so far is it might resemble a Madrid-type designation at first, and then maybe move towards a community trademark type form later. Do you know anything about that, or have you heard anything about that at all?
I haven't heard anything at all. The two Lusophone countries in Africa are obviously Angola and Mozambique, but I haven't come across anything like that at all.
Any other questions?